Chapter 5. There's the Girl Who Got Arrested. The world is a severe schoolmaster. Phyllis Wheatley, the first published African American poet. The news that a schoolgirl had been arrested for refusing to surrender her bus seat to a white passenger flashed through Montgomery's black community and traveled far beyond. One man from Sacramento, California, wrote to Claudette, "The wonderful thing which you have just done makes me feel like a craven coward. How encouraging it would be if more adults had your courage, self-respect, and integrity." In Montgomery, students stopped one another at bus corners and by their lockers saying things like, "Have you heard of Claudette Colvin?" "Well, do you know anyone who knows her? Where's she go to school?" Joanne Robinson, a professor of English at Alabama State College at the time, later wrote, "Within a few hours, every Negro youngster on the streets discussed Colvin's arrest. Telephones rang, clubs called special meetings and discussed the event with some degree of alarm. Mothers expressed concern about permitting their children on the buses." Joanne Robinson had a personal reason to admire anyone who took on the bus system. In 1949, just after she had moved to Montgomery, Robinson had boarded a bus for the airport. It was Christmas break, and she was flying off to Cleveland to visit relatives. After dropping a dime in the fare box, she absent-mindedly sat down in one of the 10 front seats reserved for whites. Still new to town, she hadn't thought to walk to the back. Besides, there were only 2 other passengers on the entire bus. Lost in holiday thoughts, she was startled by the realization that someone's face was inches from hers. It was the bus driver shouting, "Get up from there! Get up from there!" His hand was drawn back as if to strike her. She snatched up her packages and stumbled out the front door, nearly sprawling in the mud as the bus pulled away. "I felt like a dog," she later wrote. He had picked the wrong person to bully. Smart, energetic, and extremely well-connected, Joanne Robinson was an active member of the Women's Political Council, a large and influential civic group of professional black women in Montgomery. Some WPC members were Alabama State College professors. Others, including Claudette's teacher, Geraldine Nesbitt, were ASC graduates who had become teachers. Shortly after Robinson took over as president of the WPC in 1950, she led a successful campaign to make white merchants include the title Mr., Mrs., and Miss on bills and announcements sent to black customers. It was an important measure of respect. Though Robinson owned her own car and rarely rode the city bus, the memory of the driver's bullying behavior and how humiliated she had felt wouldn't go away. She started interviewing black residents who had been mistreated on the city buses and writing down their stories. She soon possessed a thick file of nightmare accounts. A note: bus boycotts. The idea of boycotting, or staying off, public vehicles until reforms were made was nothing new, but it had never succeeded for long on a large scale. Between 1900 and 1906, Montgomery was one of 25 southern cities to protest segregated streetcars through boycotts. More recently, in June 1953, the black community of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, had boycotted the city's buses for several days to protest segregated seating. Though they weren't able to evict Jim Crow, the Baton Rouge protesters developed a free ride transportation system and left a detailed blueprint for other bus protesters to follow. Robinson longed to do something about the buses, but she didn't know quite what. In March 1954, she organized a face-to-face meeting of black leaders, city officials, and bus company representatives to complain about the way blacks were treated on the buses and to propose reforms. The meeting was pleasant enough, but unproductive. She kept at it. 2 months later, she wrote a letter to Montgomery's mayor, W.A. Tacky Gale, on behalf of the Women's Political Council. Robinson pressed for 3 changes on the bus rules. 1. A new seating plan that would let blacks sit from back to front and whites from front to back until the bus filled up, as was the practice in several other southern cities. An end to making blacks pay their fares at the front of the bus, but then get off and re-enter through the rear door to find a seat at the back. And 3, a requirement that drivers stop at every corner in black neighborhoods just as they did in white neighborhoods. Robinson's diplomatic letter contained one fragment of steel. In the third to last paragraph, she wrote that if things did not get better, there has been talk from 25 or more local organizations of planning a citywide boycott of buses. The idea of a bus boycott had been gaining momentum throughout the Black community for months. Its power was obvious. Three-quarters of Montgomery's bus passengers were Black. If everyone quit riding, they could starve the City Lines bus company into reason. Still, the letter stopped short of calling for an end to the segregated seating. As Robinson later wrote, in Montgomery in 1955, no one was brazen enough to announce publicly that Black people might boycott city buses for the specific purpose of integrating those buses. Just to say that minorities wanted better seating arrangements was bad enough. Robinson's letter led only to more polite meetings. The whites offered coffee, nodded, and smiled, but refused to budge an inch when it came to Jim Crow. Still, Claudette Colvin's arrest had stripped the veneer of politeness from the talks. She had been wrenched from her seat and dragged off a bus by police in front of shocked witnesses. People were angry. Claudette's arrest made her the center of attention wherever she went. On the following Sunday, Reverend Johnson led the congregation in prayer for the girl among them who had been arrested for bravely standing up to the bus driver and the police and challenging the whole ugly system. The next day, classmates swarmed around her when she pulled up to Booker T. Washington High School in her cousin's car. They followed her into homeroom and asked to hear her story. Students pointed at her in the halls, whispering, "There's the girl who got arrested." Opinion at Booker T. Washington was sharply divided between those who admired Claudette's courage and those who thought she got what she deserved for making things harder for everyone. Some said it was about time someone stood up. Others told her that if she didn't like the way things were in the South, she should go up north. Still, others couldn't make up their minds. No one they knew had ever done anything like this before. A few of the teachers, like Miss Nesbit, embraced me, Claudette recalls. They kept saying, "You were so brave," but other teachers seemed uncomfortable. Some parents seemed uncomfortable too. I think they knew they should have done what I did long before. They were embarrassed that it took a teenager to do it. Facing serious criminal charges and with her court hearing only 2 weeks away, Claudette feared she might be sent to a reform school as a juvenile delinquent. She had a lot to lose. She was a good student with dreams of college and a career. She was not about to plead guilty to anything, but she didn't know what to do or whom to turn to. Somehow she had to find a lawyer and figure out how to pay for one. She had no time to lose. Claudette. Everyone got busy. We started working family connections, trying to find someone to help me. My great aunt's husband, C.J. McNear, told my parents to get in touch with Mr. E.D. Nixon. C.J. thought my case might be a good civil rights case. Mr. Nixon called the shots in the Black community of Montgomery. He knew everybody. So Mom called him, and he agreed to help us. A note. E.D. Nixon. When Black people had a serious problem in Montgomery, they went to E.D. Nixon. Employed as a railroad sleeping car porter, Nixon worked tirelessly throughout his life to advance the rights of Black people. A tall, rugged man with a commanding voice and an earthy sense of humor, Nixon seemed to know everyone. Jailers, white policemen, judges, newspaper reporters, lawyers, and government officials. An early president of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP, Nixon was often able to fix common people's problems through plain talk and informal dealing before they hardened into legal cases. Nixon moved swiftly on two fronts. He called Fred Gray, one of Montgomery's two Black lawyers, and convinced him to represent Claudette in court. Then he organized a committee of Black leaders to meet downtown with the police commissioner. Among those selected was the new pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, 26-year-old Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The attempt to obtain justice for Claudette Colvin marked Dr. King's political debut. A conference of Black leaders, the bus company's manager, and the police commissioner seemed to break the tension. Both men were quite pleasant and expressed deep concern over what had happened to Claudette. Dr. King later wrote, "The bus company conceded that, according to the driver, Claudette had been sitting behind the 10 white seats in front, and there had been no seats available when the driver ordered her to move. That seemed to be an admission that she hadn't broken the law. The police commissioner agreed the seating rules were confusing and promised that the city's attorney would soon clarify them in writing. The one thing they didn't do was drop the charges against Claudette. The trial would still go on. Still, Dr. King walked out of the meeting feeling hopeful, and Joanne Robinson also felt her spirits lifting as she stepped outside. We were given to understand that Claudette would be given every chance to clear her name, she later wrote. It was not to be a trial to determine guilt or innocence, but an effort to find out the truth, and if the girl were found innocent, her record would be clear. Those present left the conference feeling that everything would work out fairly for everyone. And the day before Claudette's trial, Edie Nixon also called Rosa Parks, a soft-spoken 42-year-old professional seamstress who had for many years been secretary of the Montgomery NAACP. Mrs. Parks was also the head of the NAACP's youth group in Montgomery. Nixon and Mrs. Parks had long tried to get more young blacks involved in the struggle for civil rights, but the Sunday afternoon NAACP youth meetings were, for the most part, poorly attended. However, both saw promise in the dramatic arrest, jailing, and trial of a 15-year-old bus protester. It might spark interest if the girl was willing to tell her story. Nixon urged Mrs. Parks to get Claudette Colvin involved with the NAACP. Claudette. The first time I ever met Rosa Parks was on one Sunday afternoon when she walked into a church before an NAACP youth meeting. There were only a few students around. This small, fair-skinned woman with long, straight hair came up to me and looked me up and down. She said, "You're Claudette Colvin?" Oh my God, I was looking for some big old burly overgrown teenager who sassed white people out. But no, they pulled a little girl off the bus. I said, "They pulled me off because I refused to walk off." Rosa had already asked the teachers at my school about me and found out I was a good student. She got even more interested when she realized she knew my mother, my biological mom, from Pine Level. Rosa had lived there too when she was younger. Mom was close friends with Rosa's brother, Sylvester, before she left Pine Level for Birmingham. We did all sorts of things to raise money for my lawyer. Rosa's mother baked and sold cookies. I was always eating them, and Rosa would come up and say, "Claudette, don't eat all the cookies or we won't have any to sell." Rosa put me up for Miss NAACP Montgomery chapter. I finished second, but it didn't matter. All the money from the contest went to pay my lawyer anyway. Claudette's lawyer wasn't much older than she was. Bespectacled, serious, sporting a pencil-thin mustache, and usually seen in a neatly pressed suit, 24-year-old Fred Gray was just 6 months out of law school in March 1955. The youngest of 5 children, he had grown up riding the Montgomery city buses in a triangle between school and home and his job with the newspaper. He had never himself been beaten or threatened on a bus, but he had heard more than enough insults and witnessed more than enough abuse of black passengers to last a lifetime. Like Claudette, he had vowed to study law in the North and then return home to destroy everything segregated I could find. After high school, Gray worked his way rapidly through Alabama State College, then went off to law school in Ohio. True to his pledge, he returned to Montgomery soon after graduation, passed the Alabama bar exam, and opened his practice in a tiny downtown office, finding his first clients through black churches and NAACP meetings. He had lunch almost every day with Rosa Parks, who worked across the street at Montgomery Fair Department Store. When Edie Nixon suggested he take the Claudette Colvin case, Gray leaped at the chance. Since Claudette had been charged with breaking the city and state segregation laws, Gray hoped he could use this case to show that they were unconstitutional. There had never been a chance before, since no one except Claudette Colvin had ever pleaded not guilty to breaking the segregation laws in a bus arrest. One March evening, Gray and his secretary, Bernice Hill, drove out to King Hill to meet Claudette and her parents. They sat around the Colvin's small kitchen table, sipping coffee and talking, while Hill took notes. Since Claudette was still a legal minor, one of her parents would have to file the lawsuit on her behalf. Given its importance, both parents would have to strongly support it. Gray took an instant liking to the entire family, sizing them up as brave and self-reliant. For her part, Claudette admired Fred Gray as the first person she had ever met who was doing what she herself wanted to do someday. Gray urged all 3 to consider the hazards of contesting the charges in court. By pleading not guilty, Claudette would be doing more than just talking back to whites. She would be challenging Jim Crow dead on. Her name would almost certainly be in the paper. Homes had been bombed, jobs lost, and people lynched for less. All three Colvins simply looked back at him unshaken. Gray turned to Claudette and asked if she was sure. Yes, I am, she replied. Her quick response and the family's unity of purpose sent Fred Gray off King Hill with a sense of hope. Whatever was to come, at least the Colvins were not people who would back down. There had been 13 black students on the Highland Gardens bus the day Claudette was arrested, most of them her classmates at Booker T. Washington. Gray arranged for the high school principal to issue passes for students willing to testify at Claudette's hearing. Just before the trial, he spoke to them as a group, coaching them about what they might be asked and how best to answer. In the days before Claudette's hearing, black leaders rallied around her. The Citizens Coordinating Committee, a group of predominant black men and women, mimeographed a leaflet and passed it around Montgomery, entitled To Friends of Justice and Human Rights. It described Claudette's arrest and demanded that she be acquitted of charges. It also called for punishment of the bus driver and insisted on clarification of the long-standing city bus rule, constantly ignored by drivers, that said no rider had to give up a seat unless another was available. Claudette's hearing was held on March 18, 1955, late in the morning. A cousin drove Claudette, QP, and their neighbor Annie Larkin off the hill and down to Montgomery County's juvenile court. Claudette felt certain her troubles would be over by nightfall. I thought Fred Gray was a very good lawyer, she remembers. He seemed to have prepared very well. I was confident. Because Claudette's plea of not guilty to breaking the segregation law was important to every black bus rider in Montgomery, several leaders attended the hearing, including Joanne Robinson and the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, pastor of the First Baptist Church. It was nearly noon when Claudette and Fred Gray were summoned into the small courtroom to appear before juvenile court judge Wiley Hill, Jr. Students remained in the hall, straining to hear what was going on behind the door and waiting for their names to be called. Claudette faced 3 separate charges: violating the segregation law, disturbing the peace, and assaulting one of the policemen who had pulled her off the bus. Judge Hill heard testimony from Patrolman Paul Headley and T.J. Ward, the arresting officers. Ward testified that when he placed Claudette under arrest, she had fought the officers, kicking and scratching them. She insisted she was colored and just as good as white, Ward informed the judge. The 2 officers were able to show a letter written by a white passenger on the bus that day, praising them as gentlemen, almost to the point of turning the other cheek, who spoke to Claudette in tones so soft that I doubt if any other passengers aboard the bus even heard them. When called, Fred Gray's student witnesses offered a very different story of 2 police officers confronting a teenage girl with frightening force on a packed bus. Gray challenged the law themselves, contending that the provisions of Alabama's laws and Montgomery's city ordinances requiring racial segregation were unconstitutional. Just before lunchtime, Judge Hill delivered his blunt ruling: guilty of all charges. Claudette would be placed on probation, was declared a ward of the state, and was released to the custody of her parents. He cracked his gavel, dismissing the case. As the words washed over Claudette, she felt a wave of anguish, and then everything she had been holding inside for the past 2 weeks came pouring out. Claudette's agonized sobs penetrated the atmosphere of the courthouse, wrote Joanne Robinson. Many people brushed away their own tears. Claudette: now I was a criminal. Now I would have a police record whenever I went to get a job or when I tried to go to college. Yes, I was free on probation, but I would have to watch my step everywhere I went for at least a year. Anyone who didn't like me could get me in trouble. On top of that, I hadn't done anything wrong. Not everyone knew the bus rule that said they couldn't make you get up and stand if there was no seat available for you to go to. But I did. When the driver told me to go back, there was no other seat. I hadn't broken the law. And assaulting a police officer, I probably wouldn't have lived for very long if I had assaulted those officers. When I got back to school, more and more students seemed to turn against me. Everywhere I went, people pointed at me and whispered. Some kids would snicker when they saw me coming down the hall. It's my constitutional right. It's my constitutional right. I had taken a stand for my people. I had stood up for our rights. I hadn't expected to become a hero, but I sure didn't expect this. I cried a lot, and people saw me cry. They kept saying I was emotional. Well, who wouldn't be emotional after something like that? Tell me, who wouldn't cry? Chapter 6 Crazy Times. I had crossed the line. I was free, but there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land. Harriet Tubman. Spring and summer 1955. The morning after her hearing, an article about Claudette's conviction appeared in the Montgomery Advertiser, headlined, Negro Guilty of Violation of City Bus Segregation Law. The story reminded readers that according to the city code, a bus driver has police power while in charge of a bus and must see that white and Negro passengers are segregated. As word spread, an atmosphere of tension settled over Montgomery. The verdict was a bombshell, Joanne Robinson later wrote. Blacks were as near a breaking point as they had ever been. Resentment, rebellion, and unrest were evident in all Negro circles. For a few days, large numbers refused to use the buses. Complaints streamed in from everywhere. The question of boycotting came up again and loomed in the minds of thousands of black people, Robinson continued. On paper, the Women's Political Council had planned for 50,000 notices calling people to boycott the buses. Only the specific time and place had to be added. But some members were doubtful. Some wanted to wait. The women wanted to be certain the entire city was behind them, and opinions differed where Claudette was concerned. Some felt she was too young to be the trigger that precipitated the movement. Was she too young? Could a rebellious teen be controlled? Who was this girl anyway? Robinson's WPC lieutenants probed into Claudette's background, since few adult leaders in Montgomery had ever heard of her. They already knew that her mother and father were not part of the elite social set that revolved around Alabama State College and the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Investigation showed that Claudette Colvin was being raised by her great uncle and great aunt, respectively a yard boy and a day lady, as maids were called. The Colvins lived in King Hill, a neighborhood that meant poor or inferior to most who didn't live there, and the Hutchinson Street Baptist Church, which Claudette faithfully attended, was a church for the working poor. Doubts crept in. A swarm of adjectives began to buzz around Claudette Colvin, words like emotional and uncontrollable and profane and feisty. The bottom line was, as Joanne Robinson tactfully put it, that opinions differed where Claudette was concerned. Edie Nixon later explained, I had to be sure I had somebody I could win with. So the leaders of the burgeoning Montgomery bus revolt turned away from Claudette Colvin. About the only person not involved in the discussion was Claudette. Nobody ever came to interview me about being a boycott spokesperson, she later said. I had no idea adults were talking about me and looking into my life. The only one of those people I talked to was my lawyer, Fred Gray. A note. Appealing a legal decision. The U.S. legal system begins with city and county courts, goes on to the state courts, then to federal courts, and finally to the U.S. Supreme Court. If a person does not agree with a court decision, she or he can usually appeal the case to a higher court. It's tempting to appeal, to take a second chance, but lawyers are expensive, and winning cases on appeal is not always easy, as judges are sometimes reluctant to reverse the decisions of their colleagues in lower courts. In Claudette's case, black leaders decided to appeal a decision made in Montgomery Juvenile Court to the next level, Montgomery Circuit Court, which was still within the state of Alabama's court system. The NAACP and other Montgomery groups decided not to protest Claudette's conviction with the bus boycott, but they did raise money to appeal the ruling, partly to clear her name and partly so they could keep using her case to attack the segregation law. Leaders were eager to appeal it all the way up to the federal court. Throughout March, Montgomery's black churchgoers were asked to drop a little extra in the collection plate for Claudette. By the end of the month, 14 churches and 4 civic groups had chipped in to raise almost all of what the lawyers were charging. Virginia Durr, a wealthy and influential white Montgomeryan who supported the NAACP, launched her own support drive for Claudette. She wrote Curtis McDougal, a college professor she knew, and asked him to persuade his students to collect money for the appeal and write Claudette messages of support. I just can't explain how this little girl was so brave, Mrs. Durr wrote. It was a miracle. Even after being deserted on the bus by her other companions, she would still not move. In this setting and in this town, and with four big, burly white men threatening her. Isn't that amazing? More than 100 letters soon arrived addressed to Claudette in care of Mrs. Rosa Parks, secretary of the Montgomery NAACP. On May 6, 1955, Gray went back to Montgomery City Circuit Court to appeal Claudette's conviction. After hearing testimony, Judge Eugene Carter dropped two of the three charges against Claudette, disturbing the peace and breaking the segregation law. But he kept the third, her conviction for assaulting an officer who had lifted her out of her seat and dragged her off the bus. He sentenced Claudette to pay a small fine and kept her on probation in the custody of her parents. It was a dispiriting outcome on two scores. First, Montgomery's black leaders had hoped to keep using Claudette's case in higher courts to challenge the constitutionality of segregated bus seating. But now that the Judge Carter had shrewdly dropped that charge, there was nothing left to appeal. That was specifically about segregation. All the leaders but Gray lost interest in appealing Claudette's case any further. Second, Claudette still had a criminal record. She had been convicted of assaulting a police officer, information that would forever blemish her job applications, credit record, and school transcripts. By keeping the assault charge, Judge Carter deprived Claudette of peace of mind. Now she feared that people would see her as a juvenile delinquent, a criminal, someone with a mark against her name. Had she thrown away her dreams by taking a stand? As cold, rainy weather set in, blacks returned to the buses. Claudette went back to school to finish out the last few weeks of her junior year. She soon found that attitudes at Booker T. Washington had hardened against her. It was easier to see the bus girl as a troublemaker than as a pioneer. More and more students mocked her now. Shaken, but defiant to the core, Claudette battled back in her own way. Claudette. One Saturday, I was home by myself waiting for an appointment with the beautician to have my hair straightened. And then it hit me. Why am I wasting my time and $2 good straightening my hair so I can look more white? I went straight to the kitchen and washed it. Then I pulled it out into little braids when it was still damp. When I was done, I looked like I was about 6 years old. My mother came in the door to ask me why I didn't show up at the beauty shop. Then she took one look at my hair and said, "What?" Making those pigtails was the strongest statement I could make in that school. If I had cut all my hair off, they probably would have locked me in an institution. Miss Nesbit was right. My hair was good hair, no matter what. By wearing it natural, I was saying, I think I'm as pretty as you are. All of a sudden, it seemed such a waste of time to heat up a comb and straighten your hair before you went to school. So I just quit doing it. I felt very emotional about segregation, about the way we were treated, and about the way we treated each other. I told everybody, I won't straighten my hair until they straighten out this mess. And that meant until we got some justice. When I went to school the next Monday, people were cold shocked. Teachers asked me, why would you do such a thing? They wouldn't let me be in the school play because of how I wore my hair. Classmates said I was still grieving Delphine. I tried to put it out of my mind, but no one else would. At that time, I had a boyfriend named Fred Harvey. He was in my homeroom, and I used to help him with his homework. He was really sweet. He'd take me to the movies and save enough money so he could send me home in a taxi rather than put me on the bus. But he was just stunned. He kept asking me, why? Why? Why won't you straighten your hair? I told him I thought my hair looked African, and I was proud of it. That really got him. Back then, we never used the word African. Africa was the jungle. Africa was Tarzan. We were supposed to be ashamed of our African past, but Africa made me proud. That whole spring until school was out, just about all I heard from anybody was, "You're crazy, you're crazy, you're crazy." From the time Claudette got arrested, she was the center of attention, remembers Alien Bowser, one of Claudette's classmates. But the attention wasn't directed in the wrong way. Kids were saying she should have known that what would happen, that she should have got up from her seat. Everything was reversed. Everyone blamed her rather than the people who did those things to her. They would whisper as she went down the hall. It was mean. What she did with her hair just made it worse. She had always kept her hair neatly styled, and then she came to school one day with cornrows. It was shocking. Kids had already pulled back from her. They were already whispering she was crazy and things like that. I was shocked too, but I wasn't embarrassed by what she did with her hair. I was on her side. Claudette was a wonderful person with a mind that was mature beyond her years. One day, our teacher told us to write down on a piece of paper what we wanted to be when we grew up and pass it up front. Claudette wrote President of the U.S. I think she meant it. We should have been rallying around her and being proud of what she had done, but instead we ridiculed her. School recessed for the year, and the sun set about School recessed for the year, and the sun set about baking Central Alabama. As the long, buggy summer days drifted by, Claudette spent much of her time at King Hill Park, sitting outside on the veranda, crocheting and talking to her cousin, dragging her chair around to follow the shade. Often she helped her mother take care of her white family's three young children. Every now and then she scraped up a babysitting job. Nights seemed even slower. Dances and parties were out. What if something went wrong? One false move or one malicious report, and she was a parole violator. Claudette lost touch with her friends, stayed home, and turned inward. At least there was still church. On Sundays after services at Hutchinson Street Baptist, she would go across town to Rosa Parks' NAACP youth meetings. Mrs. Parks had appointed Claudette youth secretary, which meant keeping attendance and membership records and putting out notices. The meetings were held at the red brick Trinity Lutheran Church, pastored by the Reverend Robert S. Grates. He was the only white minister in Montgomery with an all black congregation. Claudette. I only went if I could get a ride because I didn't want to ride the bus anymore. If I couldn't get a ride back, I'd stay overnight at Rosa's. She lived in the projects across the street. Rosa was hard to get to know, but her mom was just the opposite. Warm and talkative and funny. We would stay up all night gabbing, sometimes while Rosa pinned wedding dresses on me that she was altering for work. Rosa's mother knew all sorts of horror stories about black girls getting mistreated. There was nothing we couldn't talk about. Rosa Parks was like two different people inside and out. Excuse me. Rosa Parks was like two different people inside and out of the meetings. She was very kind and thoughtful. She knew exactly how I liked my coffee and fixed me peanut butter and Ritz crackers, but she didn't say much at all. Then when the meetings started, I'd think, is that the same lady? She would come across very strong about rights. She would pass out leaflets saying things like, we are going to break down the walls of segregation. I might have had more fun if the meetings had been in my neighborhood. The children in the NAACP youth group weren't like the students I went to school with. Their parents were professionals. These children went to private schools. Whenever they said they planned to go north for education after they graduated, Rosa would scold them. Why should your families have to send you north? Our colleges right here could offer you a good education too, but they're segregated. Rosa kept inviting me to tell my bus arrest story to the kids there, but after a while they had all heard it a million times. They seemed bored with it. It was during one of those summer visits across town that Claudette met someone who actually listened, or seemed to. While watching a baseball game in the park, Claudette was joined by a light skinned black man. She judged him to be maybe 10 years older than she was. Married, he said, but separated from his wife and living with his mother. He said he was a Korean War veteran and backed up his claim with lively stories from places in the distant parts of the world. Claudette. I liked talking to him. He was the first person to understand my hair. Everyone else kept saying I was crazy or mental, but he got it. He said it was impossible for black people to have really straight hair anyway. He had seen Asian women with straight hair all the way down to their feet. No black woman could ever grow hair like that no matter how hard she tried. He kept telling me to ignore what people were saying about me. I really needed to hear that. He was easy to talk to. I could relate to him. I would say things like, the revolution is here, we need to stand up. And he would agree. But all the time I knew I was getting in over my head. He was so much older than me and had so much more experience. I knew I was getting into a situation I couldn't handle, but it was hard to stop. The slow, sultry summer finally came to an end when, just after Labor Day, Claudette celebrated her 16th birthday and returned to Booker T. Washington High for her senior year. Her legal case had died with the appeal decision, and Claudette had lost contact with the adult black leaders except Rosa Parks. Still riding the bus continued to anger and humiliate blacks throughout Montgomery, and impatience was mounting. Leaders such as Edie Nixon and Joanne Robinson kept looking for the catalyst, the right person or event that would spark citywide action. On October 21st, a second teenager, 18-year-old Mary Louise Smith, defied a Montgomery's bus driver's command. She had left home early that morning to collect the $12 owed her by the White family for whom she had worked for the week before. But when she finally reached their house on the other side of town, they weren't home. Now she was not only out of her wage, which her family needed, but also the 20 cents for round trip bus fare. A week of work and a trip across town for nothing. That's what she was thinking on the bus ride home, when a red haired woman appeared in the aisle by her seat and ordered her to get up and move back. At St. Jude School, the nuns had taught Mary Louise and her siblings to respect all people, regardless of their skin color. And she did. But she was angry that day. She was thinking it was the bus driver's job to ask, and to ask politely. Muttering a rare profanity, she crossed her legs, squirmed down in her seat, and made herself very still. She had heard the bus driver's command to move, but she refused, and refused again. Next time, the driver's Next came the driver's radio call, and within minutes, a policeman entered the bus and arrested her. Mary Louise was taken downtown, booked, and jailed. She was released 2 hours later when her father arrived and paid the $14 fine. It happened so quickly and quietly that there was no newspaper publicity. No newspaper publicity. By the time E.D. Nixon and other black leaders heard about Mary Louise Smith, her fine had already been paid, and it was too late to mount a legal challenge. A note. Emmett Till. What happened to Emmett Till in the summer of 1955 was a horrible reminder of how much resistance there would be to racial integration in the South. Till was a 14-year-old Negro boy from Chicago who had gone to Mississippi to visit relatives in a small town. In August 1955, he allegedly whistled at a white store clerk and said, "Bye, baby," to her as he left the store. 3 nights later, he was kidnapped. 3 days after that, his body was found floating in a river, wrapped in barbed wire and grotesquely mutilated. 2 white men were arrested, but acquitted by an all-white jury. The savagery of the crime sent a chilling message. We talked about it a lot that summer and in school the next fall, remembers Claudette. There had been lynchings and cross burnings before, but this was a much stronger warning. Emmett Till was our age. Another teenage girl had been arrested on the bus. Who was she? Where was she from? What church did her family go to? Who were her parents? Where did they live? Soon the rumor mill was spinning out gossip that the Smith girl's father was a drunk and the family lived in a squalid shack. The truth was much different. Mary Louise later said she never in her life saw her father drunk. For one thing, he was too busy working to drink much. After Mary Louise's mother died in 1952, Frank Smith took a second job to support his 6 children. Hardly a shack, the Smith home was a 2-story, 3-bedroom frame house in a working-class neighborhood. But Mary Louise Smith, the second teenager with the nerve to face down Jim Crow on a city bus, was, like Claudette, branded unfit to serve as the public face of a mass bus protest. During the summer and fall of 1955, Montgomery's adult black activists thought hard about the buses, which looked increasingly like Jim Crow's Achilles heel. Each considered what to do in his or her own way. Joanne Robinson, E.D. Nixon, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and others continued to meet with city and bus officials, consistently pressing for black drivers and courteous treatment and a revised seating plan. Every polite refusal increased the resolve. Dr. King thought the officials were digging their own grave. The inaction of the city and bus officials after the Colvin case would make it necessary for them to meet another committee, infinitely more determined, he later wrote. Rosa Parks and Fred Gray met for lunch nearly every day, often talking about what could be learned from Claudette's case that could end segregation on the buses. In July, Mrs. Parks slipped away for a 2-week workshop on interracial relations at the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. Here, for the first time, she saw blacks and whites treated as equal. She returned, saying it had changed her life. The time was ripe for change. There was a growing impatience with segregation. Claudette had crossed a line, proclaiming that at least one young Alabaman would not share her future with Jim Crow. 7 months later, Mary Louise Smith had joined her. Now, a year and a half after Brown v. Board of Education, a few brave young people were demanding a different future. Education may have been on the way up, but transportation was on the way out. If they were branded uncontrollable or emotional or even profane, so be it. Claudette and now Mary Louise Smith had shown through their courage that at least some people were ready to act.